time, no, I think I was pretty happy with everything. With Creepshow 2. I mean, now if I looked at it and go, God, I wish we could do it, I'd probably say, let's just redo the whole movie.
Back then, it was still a proving ground for us. We were kids, literally. So we were kind of making this stuff up as we went along. I'd always grown up watching horror movies and science fiction movies. My dad is a retired physician. He was a big gadget guy. So we had the first video recorder that you could get. And the first two movies that I remember us recording was The Time Machine and Horror of Dracula. And I watched them over and over and over again. Those movies really just inspired my imagination. And I loved seeing films and being scared and trying to figure out how they did it.
And that seems to be the big thing, like in my generation at least, is that we grew up on monster movies, loved all sorts of films, loved all the classics, Creature from the Black Lagoon, Frankenstein, and the Wolfman. I first got interested doing makeup effects when I was really young. I mean, I think that I want to make monsters when I grow up. And I started, I was creative. I could sculpt and paint and draw. I was really influenced by Rick Baker and really influenced by Stan Winston and Dick Smith, who I was a huge fan of.
And, I ended up getting interested in art and drawing. And, I remember watching Planet of the Apes, getting clay and trying to sculpt a little Planet of the Apes muzzle on a whatever head form I had.
I grew up here in L.A., the San Fernando Valley. After I'd gotten out of high school, I worked for Stan Winston on Predator and Aliens and Pumpkinhead and Monster Squad, a bunch of different stuff. And eventually got to work at Rick Baker's on Harry and the Hendersons in the mid-'80s. And it was really a dream come true.
I grew up in Pittsburgh, and it's a very small film community there. If you have any interest in movies or special effects or horror, you will find yourself in the company of people like George Romero and Tom Savini. When I went to visit Creepshow set is when I met Tom. And at that point, when Tom and I got to be friends, then I subsequently got hired on Day of the Dead.
I was lucky enough to get hired in the mid-'80s on Day of the Dead, which was this George Romero zombie movie. And it was my first location job. I was 18 years old. And at that time, I had a roommate named Everett Burrell. So we packed up our stuff, got rid of the apartment, zipped out to Pittsburgh. First person we meet off the plane, Greg Nicotero.
So it was really just complete fate that we met on Day of the Dead.
George?
Yeah.
I left some on the edge of the...
And that turned out to be one of my best experiences ever.
That was really my first introduction to spending time on a movie set and getting an idea of how things work.
I mean, that was like my going away to college. Here I was on this movie. I wasn't making anything. I think we were all making like $300 a week. And that was really like frat party because there's all these guys. And we were working on the zombie movie and laughing. And Savini was the ringleader. He was the John Belushi of the pack.
I had run Tom's department for him on Day of the Dead. And the producer, Richard Rubenstein, was very impressed with how I was able to keep track of the number of prosthetics and makeup times for zombies. And how we could get 40 people done, 50 people done, and never be late and always be organized. So when Creepshow 2 came about, they wanted to assemble a lot of the same people that had worked on Day of the Dead as the effects crew. Michael Gornick was the director of photography on Day of the Dead. He was now directing. We were shooting Evil Dead 2 in North Carolina when Michael Gornick called and said, listen, we got a green light on Creepshow 2.
We need you guys to come in, and we need you to work on Creepshow 2. We have another effects guy. His name's Ed French.
Ed had done Tales from the Dark Side in New York, so they knew Ed. They were very comfortable with Ed. We want you to do for Ed what you did for Tom. You know, manage the department, keep your eye on what's going on, make sure that our deadlines are looking good. What's your schedule? And I said, well, I have about 3 or 4 more weeks of shooting on Evil Dead 2. Our schedule was winding down here.
So Greg and I flew to New York, and we had meetings and figured it out.
And as soon as I got there was a little bit of tension.
What had happened is one producer asked us to come in and supervise Ed, but Ed was never told that we were there to supervise Ed. So Greg and I would be very forceful in how we wanted things done, and then Ed would, you know, as he should, not knowing what the situation was, be very forceful back. And it became a very huge struggle, especially a struggle between Greg and Ed.
He looked at me walk in, and he's like, well, what exactly is your job? And I said, well, I was hired by the line producer to just make sure that everything is done to their satisfaction. Well, Ed didn't really like that very much, and understandably so. I mean, you don't want to ever think that there's somebody that's kind of looking over your shoulder.
So we prepped and prepped and prepped and prepped, working in Ed's little teeny space in Brooklyn, upstairs above a market, which smelled like fish. There were 3 segments. So we broke it down into the water blobby thing, which we let Ed deal with, the Indian sequence, which Mike Tersick dealt with, and then I handled all the stuff for the hitchhiker sequence.
And I got myself into a lot of trouble because I remember talking to Michael Gornick, and Michael said, how's everything going there? I said, it's hard for me to say. I'm not quite sure how we're going to utilize some of this stuff. I'm not quite sure how these things are going to play. That set off a whole series of alarm bells. And the next thing I know, I was called a spy and was banned from the workshop. Then we packed everything up and we shipped it all to Arizona, right outside of Prescott. The plan was we'd shoot 2 segments there, and then we would go to Bangor, Maine, and shoot the hitchhiker segment. They transformed an old Texaco station into our workshop,
which we renamed the Effexico.
And we had all of our props and all of our monsters and all of our things there.
It was myself, Everett Burrell, Mike Tersick, Ed French, and Greg Nicotero. And we have a short period of time to prep. I don't know how the heck we did it. Then came time to shoot the Wooden Indian stuff.
That just happens to be the subject of our first nauseating novella, Old Chief Woodenhead.
Oh, dust all over your war paint, Chief. I should have learned by now never to paint you on a dry day.
Yatta hey, Chief Woodenhead.
We knew that we had to create 2 things for Chief Woodenhead. We needed to create a full statue of him that would be used as a prop, and then we had to produce a suit. But we could only do 1 sculpture.
Mike Tersick was in charge of Chief Woodenhead. He sculpted that whole suit.
He sculpted the whole Indian thing with the exception of the head. Ed French sculpted the head, but Mike sculpted the entire body and everything. We brought this actor, this guy named Dan, and we basically did a full body cast of him, produced a fiberglass positive, and Mike Tersick sculpted the entire body. It was beautiful. Then we found these 2 Italian guys, artisans from the old country, and they produced fiberglass molds of all this stuff, feet, hands, everything we needed. Then we had to produce the prop piece. Mike and I laid in liquid latex and burlap. That was the skin, and then we blew foam into it, and then armature wire, and so we could position the statue and all that stuff. The statue was painted with acrylic paints. Mike hand painted it because we wanted to get that very worn, distressed look. We had to make a mechanical mask. The head was all radio controlled, so because all it had to do was blink.
It had just real subtle eye movement.
And then the mouth. The movements were very subtle. I think that's all it did.
Go on there, Chief Woodenhead.
We made that entire suit out of polyfoam and SC89 skin. And the suit was painted with urethane paints. And we dusted him down so when he'd move, there'd be some dust coming off. Dan, who was in the suit, was really, really great. He was a mime, and he